If you grew up in a Christian home or a religious environment, there's something that can easily become true. It's very easy if you grew up in a religious environment, religious home like I did, to end up loving your religion more than you love people. Have you noticed that? And then what happens is you end up hurting people with your religion, and you wonder why people don't want to be a part of it. Perhaps there are some of you here today, you know exactly what I'm talking about because maybe you're not so religious, or maybe there was a point in your life where you were religious and you walked away, or maybe right now you're religious, but you're kind of thinking about not becoming religious and the reason's because somewhere you bumped into a group of people that were religious and they loved their religion more than they loved people. And you thought in the back of your mind, you're like, well, that doesn't seem right. That's kind of weird. So we're in the 5th week of a sermon series that we're doing entitled 90. And for about the span of 90 days, what we're doing is we're journeying through the life of Jesus. And we are talking about some of his most significant events, encounters, and his conversations. And we're starting in the place where he was introduced into history as a man. And we're journeying through all the way to the place where he ends up giving his life as a sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. And there's one big thought and one big idea we keep returning to in this series. It's an idea and a thought that I hope that after this is all said and done, you have totally wrapped your mind around. And it's this: Jesus came to introduce something brand new to the world. But not just to the world, he came to introduce something brand new for the world. He didn't come to extend something old. He didn't come to retool and rebrand Judaism so we could have a Judaism 2.0. And he didn't come so you and I can have two parts of our Bible, an Old Testament and a New Testament. He came to introduce something brand new. And specifically, there are three things that are brand new that he came to bring. He came to bring a new covenant. There was an old covenant or an old relationship agreement, and it was between God and specifically the nation of Israel. Jesus came to fulfill that, and he came to introduce and start a brand new covenant or a brand new relationship agreement. But this new relationship agreement would be between God and everybody, between God and the whole world. He also came to introduce and bring a new command. And this new command, we're going to talk about here in a couple weeks, would end up becoming the governing ethic for the other new thing that he came to bring that would be new, a new movement, his church, you, me, us. So previously on 90, we talked about how Jesus introduced his brand new agenda, and he talked a lot about the upside down nature of what he came to bring, and he did it in something that you and I call the Sermon on the Mount. Now, you and I tend to think about the Sermon on the Mount as a one-off sermon that Jesus preached, but it was actually content that he preached and taught over and over and over and over again. And all throughout the Sermon on the Mount, what he did was he contrasted the new that he was coming to bring with the old that everybody was familiar with. And so 6 different times in the Sermon on the Mount, he would say, "You've heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, but I say." And naturally, the more that Jesus did that, it caused tensions to rise, and people start to wonder, well, dude, what are you trying to do? So he addresses that, and here's what he says. He says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets." Now, the law or the prophets are what you and I refer to as the Old Testament. It was the Old Covenant. And so Jesus is saying, look, I'm not here to edit it. I'm not trying to change it. I'm not going to add to it or anything like that. I haven't come to abolish it. I have not come to abolish them, but I have come to fulfill them. In other words, he's saying you guys haven't totally missed what I'm saying. Change is coming. Things are going to be different. I didn't come to maintain the status quo or extend something that's been done before. I'm here to do something new. In other words, what Jesus is saying is he's saying, look, if this were a plane, I'm landing it. If this were a math problem, I'm solving it. If this were an assignment, I'm completing the assignment. Now, after Jesus finished outlining the upside-down nature of the new, he ended up, here's how the crowd responds. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. So as Jesus is kind of outlining the new, they're watching Jesus teach and they're thinking, man, He's doing it like he has the actual authority to be doing this stuff. Not like our teachers that kind of borrowed authority from other people in other places. He's actually speaking in an authoritative way. Now, that raised some pretty big questions in their mind. Because what they do is they start to wonder, well, does he actually have authority? And if he does have authority, how much does he actually have? So a couple days later, 3 or 4 or whatever, Jesus ends up in an interesting conversation with a group of Pharisees. Here's how it started. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some of the heads of grain and eat them. So Jesus and his disciples are traveling from place to place, and they either walk through a grain field or by a grain field. Apparently, they haven't eaten that day. They're hungry, and while they're walking through, some of the disciples reach down, and they pick some of the grain, and they begin to eat it. And this is where it kind of gets interesting. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." So what you need to know is that everywhere that Jesus went, there was generally a crowd. A crowd of people just followed him from place to place, and they wanted to hear his teachings, and they wanted to see, hey, what new cool thing is Jesus going to do? And in almost every crowd that followed Jesus, there were at least a couple people there that were extremely religious that didn't like Jesus. They didn't like the stuff he was saying, and they didn't like that he was getting the attention of the crowds. And so what they would do is they would wait till either Jesus or his disciples did something, and then they would try to point it out so as to discredit Jesus in front of the crowd. So they see Jesus' disciples picking the grain, and they say, "Look." And they do this in such a way that they're trying to draw as much attention as possible. So imagine they maybe did this a couple times, and there's a little bit of a dramatic pause, and they wait for everybody to notice. The crowd turns in, they pay attention, they kind of hush down, they pull in. Jesus and his disciples are there, they're looking straight on at this guy, and he goes, "Look, that's not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now what this does is it launches Jesus and these Pharisees into this almost back and forth debate. Jesus starts out by saying, "Look, man, you and I both know that the law doesn't actually say that they can't do that." And then he pushes in a little bit further and he says, on top of that, don't your priests, don't they work on Sunday? That's kind of Jesus' version of saying, hey, don't your pastors, don't they work on Sunday? Your priests work on the Sabbath, pastors work on Sunday. And they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And right in the middle of this conversation, Jesus decides to put his finger on the real issue that's going on. And here's what he says, and he drops this principle. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So he turns to these guys and he goes, you know, your problem is you've gotten the cart before the horse. You believe that God loves his law more than he loves people. And you have prioritized the law over people. You have started, you now love your religion more than you love people. Now, this is the essence of legalism. Legalism is when you and I, when we love a view or we value a view over a you. And again, some of you know what that's like. Some of you have struggled with Christians and Christianity because you ended up in a place where people seem to value their view more than you or your loved one or whatever. Now, the interesting thing is, as you read through the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life, every time Jesus bumped into it, he handled it the same way. Here's how he handled it. When people used the law of God to dishonor people made in the image of God, Jesus was quick. And when I say quick, I mean lightning quick. He was quick to remind them that they were on the wrong side of God. Every single time. So the conversation keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And then they get to the end of the conversation and Jesus leans in, and I think he kind of does this almost with a big grin on his face, but he leans in and says something to them that is nearly unimaginable in their minds. It's something that we talked about last week, but at the end of the conversation, Jesus leans in and here's what he says. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Hey guys, you've prioritized your religion over people. But the temple that's at the very center of your faith, something greater than that, is here. Now, for the people hearing these words, you and I read them all the time, and we don't think much about it. But for the people who are hearing these words, this was unimaginable. They're sitting there listening to Jesus say these things, and I'm sure in the back of their mind, they're thinking, okay, I'm not sure what this is. This is either arrogance or ignorance or insanity. It's one of those, I can't figure out which, but the one thing I am sure of is that this is blasphemy. Because Jesus has just threatened the temple. And in Israel, when you threatened the temple, you didn't just threaten the temple, you threatened the entire nation because their whole way of life was oriented around the temple. People, Israelites, would have died before they allowed anybody or anything to desecrate that sacred place. That was a big deal. Interestingly, about 7 years after Jesus says this, there's an emperor named Caligula, Emperor Gaius Caligula, who decided he wanted a statue that was made after him to be placed inside the temple walls. So he sent it to Israel, and there was a guy named Petronius, who was the governor of Syria, who was responsible for going and receiving it and making sure it got all the way to where it needed to be and was placed inside the temple. So Petronius takes a couple legions of the Roman army with him to the coast to pick up the statue of Emperor Caligula. When he gets there, he's met by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Jews that are protesting. They insist, no, you can't do this. We don't want this. This is going to desecrate our sacred space. So Petronius threatens them with violence. And then what they do next is unbelievable. They bow down, they pull down their cloak, and they extend their necks, and they tell Petronius, look, we would rather die than you desecrate our temple. Now, Petronius is a little thrown by this, but eventually he's able to maneuver the crowds and everything, and he makes his way to Tiberias. But when he gets to Tiberias, he's met by an even larger crowd. Tens of thousands of Jewish people have showed up to protest that statue being put in the temple. The first century historian Josephus tells us about what happened, and here's how he described it. So they threw themselves down upon their faces and stretched out their throats and said they were ready to be slain. And they did this for 40 days. Life in Tiberias stops. Farmers don't go to work. Nobody goes to work. Everybody, every day, all day long, shows up and they protest. And they tell Petronius, we would rather die than you desecrate our temple. Well, things are sort of escalating for Petronius because farmers aren't working and the local economy is falling apart. And this thing's getting more and more intense by the day. And he's trying to figure out what to do. He could have them killed, but that's genocide, and he wants no part in that. It's not like they're armed people rising up against him. So he sits down and he writes a letter to Caligula, the emperor, to ask for his advice about what to do. Now, it's a risky letter for Petronius to write because it's highly likely that Petronius will lose his job because of incompetence and potentially even his life. But he writes the letter anyway, because he just does not know what to do. Fortunately for Petronius, by the time that letter reached Rome, Caligula had been assassinated. But when Jesus says these words, when he says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here, that's unimaginable for them. But it's not just unimaginable. In their minds, it's also impossible. Because of the way that the temple was made. You see, this is actually not their first temple. Their first temple was made by Solomon, and Solomon's temple was beautiful, it was magnificent. And then the Babylonians came in and they captured and destroyed the temple and carted off anything of value and even took the best and the brightest in the nation of Israel and carted them off with them. Many years later, Cyrus the Great allowed those exiled people to come back to Jerusalem and to build their temple. But he told them, you can't build it the way that it was. I don't want a big temple. You can build like an economy-sized temple, something, functional but not really flashy. So they build that temple. And the text tells us that there are people who were there when that second temple was built, who were there also when Solomon's temple was still there. They wept because that second temple was just a shadow of the magnificence of Solomon's temple. Well, about 20 years before Jesus was born, Herod the Great comes to the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, and it's part of an attempt to kind of keep them quiet and pacify them, but he tells them, look, I want to build you a temple. And at first they resisted, and then they started negotiating back and forth, and eventually they agreed. And Herod built his temple, and his temple was magnificent. In fact, here's a model of Herod's temple. Now, I want to kind of walk you through some of this because, when you look at a picture, you really don't normally get a hold of how big and how amazing this is. This plaza and everything in it is about the span, it's about 37 acres. And some parts of this wall are about 100 feet high. This is the temple here. I think the height of the temple from the plaza base is about 60 feet or so. It's truly amazing. And the thing that made this the wonder of one of the wonders of the ancient world is that the whole thing is made of cut stone. Like they hauled, I don't know where they got it. And to this day, there's people who are like, I don't know how they did that. I don't think we can do that today, man. But it's just unbelievable. Some of the stones in this plaza and some of the stones in the wall and some of the stones in the temple are 44 feet by 11 feet by 16 feet. Truly staggering in size. They weigh in excess of 500 tons. It's just unbelievable. You see, this area in which the temple was built, it was actually prone to earthquakes. Earthquakes happen there an awful lot. And so what Herod did when he built his temple is he wanted to build a temple that was earthquake-proof. And the Jews were extraordinarily proud of this. It's a wonder of the ancient world. It's unbelievable. And so when Jesus says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here, they're looking at all this stuff. They're looking at these massive stones. They're looking at the plaza. They're looking at all this and they're like, is there even something greater than the temple? Like, is that even possible? So sometime later, Jesus and his disciples are in the temple doing their thing, and on their way out, here's what happens. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. So they're walking out, and one of Jesus' disciples turns and looks back at the temple, something he's probably seen over 1,000 times in his lifetime. But for him, it's unbelievably captivating. And he finds himself in a moment where he sees something familiar but can't quite get over how amazing it is. Perhaps you've been in a moment like that too, where something, no matter how many times you encounter it, it just blows you away. This happens to me with my wife, like almost on a weekly basis. I look at her and I'm like, man, she is so beautiful, like inside and out. And I just can't get over her. Maybe something like that's happened to you. So the disciples, they're looking and they're going, God, Jesus, look at this. Look at these stones and look at these, this is just amazing, isn't it? So Jesus responds, do you see all these great buildings? And then he says something that just shocked them. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown. Thrown is a literal translation from the Greek. When Jesus said thrown, he meant thrown down. Jesus didn't say, hey, it'll fall down, it'll get old and rot. Thrown down. And they're standing there looking at these massive stones. And they're saying, well, like thrown down, like into the valley, thrown down? Jesus like, yeah, thrown down. And they're sort of waiting for the punchline. Waiting for Jesus to go, just kidding, gotcha. But it never comes. Jesus essentially said, hey, don't get too impressed. It's a teardown. It's a teardown. And in their minds, they're thinking, but Jesus, this temple was built to be earthquake proof. What kind of force would it take to tear that down? It would take an army. And if that ever happened, then man, that'd be the end of the world as we know it. That would be like apocalyptic in nature. But Jesus never once takes it back. He says, look, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Everyone. So a little while later, in verse 3, we read, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. I was here in this very spot about a year ago that is being described right here. When you sit there, you get this panoramic view of Jerusalem. It's unbelievable. It's just beautiful, breathtaking. So they're sitting there and they're looking at this sort of panoramic view of Jerusalem, which includes the temple. And they're sitting there, and all these things that Jesus is saying about the temple is still banging around in their minds. And then so Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. They came to him and they look, Jesus, you're going to have to help us because we don't understand. You're saying these crazy things and kind of, So here's what they ask him. Tell us, when will these things happen? Jesus, you're going to have to help us out. When is this going to happen? And then Jesus tells them. In fact, I'm not going to walk through all of it with you, but if you have your Bible sometime later on this week, turn to Luke chapter 21 and read what Jesus tells them. Here's the Reader's Digest version. Look, when this day happens, if you're in or around the city of Jerusalem, run for your life. If you have to leave everything behind, run far, run fast. And you go, woe to those who are pregnant and woe to those who are nursing. Guys, if you have pregnant wives during that time, or you have nursing wives during that time, or you have cousins or anybody in your life that's in that stage of life, woe to them. Pray that they're not here when that happens. Pray that they're not pregnant. Pray that they're not nursing. Because when that day comes, men will cry out for mercy and they will receive none. And Jesus says all this, and he's not apologetic at all. He's not nostalgic. In fact, when you read it, you almost get this sense that Jesus is sort of sad, but he never takes it back. 40 years later, Rome has been battling these rebel groups that rise up all over Israel. And just prior to the event, I'm going to tell you, there was a big battle between Rome and some of these rebel groups. And the rebel group ended up winning. It was actually a major battle. And the Jewish rebels started to think, well, maybe this is our time. Maybe we can actually do this. Maybe we can actually overthrow Rome. And it sort of excites the movement. So Rome decides they have to deal with this rather decisively. So they send in the 10th Legion and a whole bunch of other Roman legions to deal with it. And the Romans start corralling these different rebel groups into, finally when they get them all into the city of Jerusalem. When they're all in the city of Jerusalem, the Romans begin to lay down siege work to get everything going. But about the time they're doing this, there are all these Jewish pilgrims, thousands of people that are making their way to Jerusalem because it's festival time. And at first, Rome says, no, you can't go in there. And then they start to think about it, and they're like, wait a minute. This can speed up the process for us here. Let's let them all in. In fact, let's escort them in. So they escort thousands of people into Jerusalem until the city is literally packed to the gills. And when the last person is in there, they seal the door and they complete the siege works. And what happened inside of the city of Jerusalem was nothing short of horrific. They fought with the Romans by day and they fought with each other by night. They were so convinced that they were going to win that at night they would literally fight with each other over who was going to be the next king. Fires were started, food supplies were quickly depleted. And on I think August 6th, I think it is, AD 70, the Roman legions breached the second wall in Jerusalem. And when they went in there, they killed anything that could not be sold into slavery. They burned everything that they could. And they went to that temple site where those magnificent stones were, and they pulled them down and dragged them across the plaza and threw them into the valley below. Just as Jesus predicted. In fact, you can go there today and see some of the stones. Here's a picture of it. These are what some of the stones look like. They were dragged across that plaza by the Roman army and tossed into the valley below. It's incredible. And by the way, this whole prophecy thing, this whole prediction that Jesus makes, if you're here and you're wrestling with, man, do I take Jesus seriously or do I not? And what do I do with the claims of Jesus? I think this is one of those things that you should take seriously. I think this is one of those reasons why you need to seriously consider Jesus, because Jesus predicted this and it happened. You can fact check me. Your history book records this stuff. This happened just like Jesus said that it would. If you go there today, here's what you'll see. A building you're probably familiar with, the Dome of the Rock. This sits on the site where Herod's temple used to be. In this plaza, and I was here, I went to this space last year, I was right around here. Not too far away from this is a mosque that was built alongside it. But the temple was never rebuilt. It was Muslim for a while, and then during the Crusades, they took over and they turned that mosque into a church. And then Saladin came and he took it back, and now it's currently, to this day, it's under Muslim control. The temple was never rebuilt, just as Jesus predicted. Just as he predicted. And when that happened, ancient Judaism died, never to be resurrected. Rabbinic Judaism was started after that. But this is incredible. You know, when Matthew writes about this, the temple was still standing when he tells us what Jesus said. When Mark writes about this, and he tells us what Jesus said, the temple was still standing. When Luke writes about it and tells us what Jesus said, the temple was still standing. But it happened just as Jesus predicted. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. And the temple would be replaced. It would end up being replaced by something new, something improved, something universal, and something portable. Something new, something improved, something universal, and something portable. Now, about 20 years after Jesus says this, while the temple is still standing, there's a guy named Paul who's an ex-temple loving, ex-Christian persecuting Pharisee who sits down to write a letter to a group of ex-pagans in a city called Corinth. And he tries to help them understand why everything I've been telling you is so important. And here's what he tells them. Do you not know? And the reason why he said that is because they didn't know. They had no idea that what Paul's about to tell them was true. Do you not know that your bodies are, and say it with me, temples? Say it again. Yeah. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. In other words, he's telling them, while the temple is still standing, that look, you guys who think that God dwells in the temple, that the Spirit of God is there, those of you who think that God dwells in the Holy of Holies, you're wrong. God is no longer there. God, he tells them, has left the building. Now, you and I read these words and we kind of pass over them and we don't really think about them. But for the ex-Jewish believers, the ex-Jews and those ex-pagans, this was ripe with implications. For them, here's what they understood Paul to be communicating. Sacred has been commuted. Sacred has been commuted. Like it's been moved. There are no longer sacred objects, and there are no sacred places, and there's no sacred geography. Only now there are sacred individuals. And this has huge implications for us today, because here's what this means. It means that right now, in this moment, you are sitting next to sacred. It means that if you're married to sacred. It means that if you're raising children, you are raising sacred. It means that if you have a job that you go to work with people and during the day, you're going to work with sacred. It means if you go to the gym and you work out, you're working out next to sacred. It means if you go to the ball fields to play a game or to watch a game, you're going there next to sacred. What Jesus does here and what this means, it set the stage for human dignity and human freedom and human worth, because there's an inextricable link between the message of Jesus and human freedom. There's an inextricable link between human value and the cross. The price that Jesus paid to declare for all time the value and the worth of every single human being, regardless of gender, regardless of race. Jesus told them, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And it was. It was. And just like Jesus predicted, the temple was torn down. And as we talked about last week, Roman temples all throughout the Roman Empire, 350 years later, would be torn down. And the reason they would be torn down is because the life and light of God had come to the world, and it changed everything. Sacred had been commuted. And there's no place for loving our religion more than we love people. Because we live with sacred. We interact with sacred. No more sacred spaces. No more sacred geography. No more sacred objects, just sacred individuals. And so Jesus has this very simple invitation. Follow me. Follow me. Follow me. Follow me, and I'll give you life that's truly life. Follow me, and I'll give you purpose. Follow me, and you'll find meaning. Follow me, and you'll get to experience peace that surpasses all understanding. Follow me, because I, for once and for all, declare the value of every single person, every single place for all time. Follow me, because I am faithful. Follow me. Just follow me. It's an invitation he extends to every single one of us. And so don't miss next week as we talk more about Jesus' very simple invitation. Come back next week and bring somebody with you, because next week we're going to pick it up right there.